We are the sister organization of the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank in Washington, D.C. It was founded in 1973. They really do the work of putting together policy research and innovative ideas. And our job at Heritage Action is to really take that research, take all of that information, and work to make it a reality. And we do that through what we like to call our inside-outside strategy. So we have our team that is inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C., on a day-to-day basis, really working to advance those conservative ideas, meeting with members of Congress, some of which you've gotten to hear from this weekend, and their staff, really working, I think, to kind of translate those conservative ideas into actual legislative text, and then also, I think, really working to strategize, of course, to advance those ideas, and then Washington is never short on bad ideas as well, and so working to kind of oppose and block some of those as well. So that's kind of our inside strategy, but James and I get to really work on what we consider sort of the outside game of Heritage Action, which is the grassroots, which really is just everyday citizens who are working in their communities to advance conservative ideas in their counties and in their congressional districts. And so it's really, I think, an incredible opportunity. We love working with what we call Heritage Action Sentinels, so people who are standing on the front lines of freedom, working to defend freedom in their local districts. So we, I think, really want to spend kind of the next 45 minutes talking through just kind of some of the practical thoughts that we have in terms of, how you can really begin to take action in terms of getting involved in the legislative process. I know we've talked to a lot of folks this weekend. Some of you are seasoned veterans in the political process. You're involved in kind of your local communities. Some of you, this is kind of your first foray into politics, and so we want to really kind of begin to dive into sort of 4 areas that we really see opportunities, because we really see grassroots as being key, I think, a key component to really winning on conservative policy ideas and moving the ball forward. So James, talk us a little bit through sort of this first thing that we were kind of thinking through in terms of opportunities for conservatives to get, really grassroots to get involved.
Sure. So thanks for having us. Again, I'm James Quarles. I'm the Southeast Regional Coordinator for Heritage Action. I cover the Southeast region, South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee. We wanted to talk today about, and I don't know if we have the slides up on the screen yet or not, but really just that the left is increasingly out of touch with the American voting public, right? And you probably heard from our colleague Nathan Rogers yesterday and talked a little bit about the polling that we did at Heritage Action to figure out, right, where are the voters, especially in swing districts and swing states, where are they on the issues, especially as they relate to the proposals that the left are putting out right now. And the first thing we wanted to talk about today is exposing the left's radical positions, because that's what they are, right? We've heard a lot of talk this weekend so far of some of the crazy proposals that are out there. And I've got a couple of examples here. One is immigration, right? It's just a vast, vast difference in where the left is on this issue and where the vast majority of the American people are. Actually, for a large majority of voters in swing districts and states, immigration is a top issue. It's a very important issue to them. And when you look at the polling, it bears out that it's not because, hey, we want just open borders. They want a robust legal immigration system, but to fix our broken illegal immigration system. Medicare for all, or single payer as the left calls it, is wildly unpopular. 70% of voters in swing districts oppose getting rid of private health insurance, which is exactly what Medicare for all would do, right? Every single candidate on the Democratic debate stage this past week and in their first debate a few weeks back proposed and raised their hand when they were asked if they would do away or would support a Medicare for all package, which is getting rid of private health insurance. It's wildly unpopular for 70% of the voting people there in swing districts and states around the country. Socialism, just from a top-line perspective, with economic systems, socialism is wildly unpopular too. Only 20% of voters in these places think that socialism is the preferable economic system when compared with capitalism. That's an encouraging number to point to, but also realize, again, on the left, many of the candidates for office right now are espousing socialist policies. That's an opportunity. But it's not just on these. I think there is a real opportunity, especially on social issues. So that's where I think in the past, there has been almost a tendency among politicians running for office to focus on the voters who are fiscally conservative but socially liberal or just agnostic on those issues, which if you look at the actual voting public and where their opinions are on policy, that section of the electorate is actually very small in comparison to the people who care about social issues from a conservative standpoint and are fiscally conservative. So we as conservatives, I think, are right to focus on both fiscal and social issues as well as defense, but there is a real opportunity on the social side of things here. And there are two examples that I want to talk through while we're here today, one of which is life, right? So I know that Nathan Rogers, our colleague yesterday, mentioned this, but 76% of people believe that if a baby is born as a result of a failed abortion, that baby should be entitled to medical care that could potentially save their lives, right? Unfortunately, right now, there is a gap in federal law where there is no real defined duty of care for these infants who survive abortions. So we're not talking about abortion, we're talking about a baby who is alive, outside the mother, surviving on its own for the time being, but it needs medical care, just like any other baby who's born prematurely, and could be easily saved with just medical care. So the Born Alive Abortion Survivor Protection Act is a bill that would address this issue. Now, keep in mind, 76% of people, that's not 76% of conservatives, that's not 76% of Republicans, that's 76% of all voters in these swing states. And in fact, I think the number across the board is closer to 78%. So it's almost an 80-20 issue that people agree that, hey, this is a no-brainer. We should have a duty of care for these infants here. But what happened with this Born Alive bill in the House of Representatives, it was introduced by a Republican member, and they asked for a roll call vote on it, an up or down vote, and Nancy Pelosi and House Democrats blocked those efforts. And as of last week, they've blocked those efforts 76 times. The 76th time took place just this past week. So it's funny, they blocked the effort for 76 times, and 76% of people think that's a bad idea. Okay. So in reality, what we need to do here is point out just how vast the difference is in the policy that they're pushing or opposing there and the place where the American people are on the issue. So there is a way to get people on the record here. So practically speaking, there is what's called a procedural tool called a discharge petition, which if it garners the signature of a majority of House members, which is 218 is the required number, the bill would bypass the committee process. It would go to the floor within a certain number of legislative days for an up or down vote. So right now, there are 201 signatures on the discharge petition. So we lack 17 as of right now. All Republicans have signed on so far, and 3 Democrats have signed on. Now, you might ask yourself, okay, well, this is a 76% people oppose this, or 76% of people agree with this policy. It's almost an 80-20 issue. That is a slam dunk frankly, for both parties in Congress. Anytime you can find an 80-20 issue, that's something that you really want to jump onto. But right now, 100% of the Republicans in the House have signed on to this discharge petition, saying that they are in favor of providing this medical care for these babies. Meanwhile, only 3 Democrats out of their majority of over 218 members have signed on. That's a vast difference, and it's a way to get them on record. So right now, we need 17 more signatures on the discharge petition that will all have to come from Democrats. So we need to be asking Democratic members, and especially Democratic members who represent red districts or swing districts, especially in Georgia 6 with Lucy McBath, to sign on to this discharge petition. This is a no-brainer, but even if they don't, and even if we don't end up with the majority of signatures on the discharge petition, this is an excellent way to get them on the record and to highlight their positions, right? I mean, this is an issue that 80% almost of Americans think is a good idea to do. This is our opportunity to point out just how wild their position on this is. The other example here that I wanted to talk about is the Equality Act, and many of you may have heard of this. If you haven't, it is a Democratic priority bill. It's H.R. 5 in the House of Representatives. What it would do basically is add sexual orientation and gender identity as 2 protected classes under civil rights law and federal law. So that has wide-ranging consequences for especially religious liberty. It's very difficult also to enforce. I mean, when you're talking about oftentimes behavior and things that gender identity, for example, is literally a definition of what you identify as at this moment, right? It can change, and oftentimes it does change. It's really it's tough to apply this law in a way that protects religious liberty, and it's ultimately at odds with that. Now, what this bill does, it has wide-ranging consequences in real life, not just from kind of a nebulous religious liberty standpoint, but there are some real bad things that happen as a result of this. Some examples are pro-life organizations, pro-life adoption agencies, such as there's one I think in North Carolina, I forget the name of it at the moment, but they seek to adopt children into families with both a mother and a father that accords with their faith. They believe that in Scripture, Scripture is the Word of God, and that is the teaching of their faith, and so they seek to serve their community according to their faith. Well, if the Equality Act were to be put in place, these organizations like this that operate under faith statements like that would either be forced with totally going against their religious beliefs and morals, totally sacrificing their principles on that stand, or closing their doors and helping no children, for example. It's a tough position to be in, and I know that many organizations so far have already come under fire with lawsuits, being targeted by the left in this way, and that's not popular at all. 65% of people think that organizations like those should be able to serve their communities according to their own religious beliefs and morals. That's not that controversial. It's a really large majority there. Another example is, and I know that many of you have probably heard about this on the news in recent days, with biological males who are transgender competing on female sports teams or against female competitors. This is another real issue, and it's not just because of hurt feelings or anything like that. A lot of times, sports is the avenue to education, and oftentimes, a lot of females will get scholarships to college because they are standout athletes in their sport. Unfortunately, when these biological males compete in those sports, it takes away opportunities for these females to be able to compete in their own sport in a fair manner. And that's also wildly unpopular. It's 62% for that one that think that is a crazy policy. And then we don't have polling on this last one, but it is just a very stark contrast of what the left is pushing. In Alaska, a municipal government in Alaska, there has a homeless shelter there, and actually a transgender individual, a biological male, has basically been allowed to, the shelter's been forced to allow him to sleep merely 3 feet away in the same room as other females who have been victims of rape, of sexual assault, and domestic violence. So for these women, it is traumatizing to be having to sleep 3 feet away from a biological male oftentimes. And really what this law does is just take away these spaces that females have, whether it's locker rooms, whether it's bathrooms, whether it's homeless shelters, the religious space, whether it's organizations serving according to their beliefs. And the list goes on and on and on. There are all kinds of bad things, but the point here remains, yes, the bill is unpopular as itself, but the individual policies and the individual outcomes of this bill are equally, if not more so, unpopular when we point these things out. If you ask someone, are you in favor of this kind of thing? They say, no, absolutely not. That's crazy, right? And I think that represents a real opportunity for us to be able to just highlight, say, well, this is a major priority of the left. It's one of their top 5 priorities, in fact. It's H.R. 5. They list their bills 1 through 10 for their top priorities. And in fact, this bill actually passed the House of Representatives with every Democrat voting in favor of it. So we'll talk a little bit more about that particular bill a little bit later, but those are just some examples of where we can point out just the absurdity of the left's radical positions. But Stephanie, can you talk a little bit about some practical things that we can do to maybe make this even more stark on the ground here?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, because obviously I think, the folks in this room were the kind of, people who are sharing on our social media pages. I think there's also really great opportunities for us to think about things like letters to the editor, I know in today's day and age, it can feel a little tough to break through the news cycle, but I always tell our Sentinels, they for sure are not going to publish your letter if you don't submit it. And so your odds of getting published are at least better if you submit it. But I think there's two things that really stand out to me, in particular to the time that we're in right now, which is August. So in August, we have in the House and the Senate, you have what's called a district work period, which we all call recess. So you have the opportunity for you to get, I think, more access to your member of Congress. I think the ability to really grab a little bit more attention, because I think attention tends to turn a little bit back more towards the district. And so you've got, the House started their recess this week. The Senate will start their recess next week, and so members are just a little bit more accessible, which I think kind of provides two opportunities. One is to meet with them, which might sound a little counterintuitive to try to ask to meet with a Democrat member, but I think it really, I think, is something that also can often make a difference at the end of the day. You may not necessarily see the fruit of your kind of activism efforts, but I think what was really interesting to me in talking to one of our colleagues who had worked on the Hill for a conservative member, he shared a story about, working for that member. He's like, we met with constituents who were affiliated with Planned Parenthood. It didn't necessarily change the outcome of our vote at the end of the day, but you can be sure that when we were going to the floor, that meeting weighed on our mind. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to really insert ourselves into this debate, to really engage on some of these issues like the Born Alive discharge petition. I think we're always looking to put out resources at Heritage Action. We have kind of a claims and response that we've got on our website of kind of how to navigate sort of the debate and those conversations with some of the kind of just rebutting some of the excuses that we've heard from Democrats on, why they're opposed to this particular bill. But I think the second thing that, if you can't meet with that member, maybe you're not, able to kind of have sort of that one-on-one personal accountability moment, to really think about what we sometimes call public accountability. So really kind of engaging, I think, back to the idea of educating and exposing the radical positions of the left, to really, I think, begin to look for opportunities to educate your community. And I think that comes down to a lot of times thinking about things like sine waves and rallies. It's a little maybe old school, kind of gritty grassroots, but I think looking for opportunities to really draw attention in a way that lets us educate. So I know it can feel a little tough sometimes in a little bit of a bigger media market like Atlanta, but I think there's things that we can sometimes do to really be able to capture attention a little bit more effectively. So I think timing can sometimes play a role in terms of if you're doing something midday, sometimes there's more staff available on kind of a Friday midday than if you're doing something on a Saturday or during kind of rush hour. I think the second thing really that's key in terms of thinking about making these events a success is thinking about the visuals. So not just telling the story, but sort of showing and kind of creating a visual component to your story. So if you're talking about babies born alive and you've got a member who's maybe flip-flop back and forth, think about something with baby flip-flops, that kind of, brings sort of an illustration to the humanity and kind of creates a visual that sort of helps highlight and kind of bring interest to your story in a way that's a little bit more visually compelling. And then I think also just remembering our audience, which is our communities. So a lot of times, I think we can get caught up in just sort of, there's the radical left's position, but there's a lot of people who maybe have open minds or they don't know the radical position that their member has taken. And we have a real opportunity by kind of drawing attention to the issue to educate. And then I think to really kind of amplify and kind of create some pressure on that member to respond.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about some things where there are already these debates going on. Oftentimes the debate is not already going on, or maybe people don't want to have the debate, or maybe the media is focused on something completely different. What can we do when the debate's not going on? Are there ways to force these? And can you talk us through what that might look like?
Yeah, so I think the question is when there's not a debate, how do you start one? How do you kind of pick sort of that legislative fight? And I think we talked a little bit about the idea of a discharge petition where you're working to kind of build signatures, get members on record in the event of either getting your bill to the floor or kind of exposing, who quite frankly supports infanticide and who is unwilling to go on record. But I think the other kind of legislative tool in the toolkit to highlight is something called motions to recommit. And I think it really helps, or I think Newt Gingrich really had a great quote, and he said that you have to give the press confrontations. Because when you give them, confrontations, you get attention. And when you get attention, you get the opportunity to educate. And so looking for these opportunities to create legislative conflict in a way that draws attention and lets you educate. And I think that's where something like a motion to recommit can really be kind of a tool in your legislative toolkit to do that. And so I think the way to think about a motion to recommit, if you really want to kind of get into the sort of the technical weeds of how they work, come see me afterwards. But I think the simplest way to think about them is before the House votes on a bill, right before the final passage vote, there's a vote on what's called a motion to recommit. It's kind of the final stop before the passage vote. And so the minority party has the opportunity to offer this. So that means anyone who is planning to vote no. And the functional way that it really tends to work is it's more or less something along the lines of an amendment vote. It's a lot of different ways that it can kind of take shape, but it really, I think, kind of takes shape often as an amendment vote. Now, the excuse that you're going to hear, I think, from, in particular, a Democrat member is, well, this is just a procedural vote. It's just kind of a formality. It doesn't really matter. This is just an attempt of the Republicans to divide the Democrats. I think at the end of the day, what that really says is they don't want to go on record. They don't want to go on record, because it puts them in a tough position, because it's highlighting an issue that maybe their constituents see a little differently. And so I think, we've actually seen some really good procedural hardball from the Republicans this Congress. I think kind of 3 sort of motion to recommit votes that stand out that kind of illustrate how this can be used is, the first, I think, time we saw it used successfully was there was a vote on Yemen, and they attached a motion to recommit that condemned anti-Semitism. And the vote on that motion to recommit was 424 to 0. So every single Democrat voted for the substance of that motion. And so really, I think that kind of set the stage for this to become an accountability point. I mean, they voted on the actual substance of the legislation, and this begins kind of a policy conversation, because we also saw yet another motion to recommit pass this Congress. So we had H.R. 8, which was the bipartisan background check bill, dealing with gun control. The left was, attempting to increase gun control. And there was a motion that was offered that would have required that ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, be notified in the event that an illegal immigrant attempts to purchase a firearm and fails a background check. And that actually also passed. I think the vote was something like 220 to 209. And so that kind of draws that contrast, I think, kind of creates sort of, quite frankly, it does create, I think, tension in the Democrat Party in a way that raises an issue to the surface in the media and allows kind of an opportunity to really, I think, educate and kind of, again, bring that issue to the surface. It doesn't always, I think, necessarily have to be a successful, quote, a successful vote where you pass the motion to recommit. I think we've also seen with a vote like on H.R. 1, which was the elections bill, there was a motion to recommit that expressed the sense that allowing illegal immigrants to vote dilutes kind of the voting power and kind of the voting franchise of U.S. citizens. And so kind of raises that conversation of who should be allowed to vote and what does it mean to be a U.S. citizen. And so kind of raising that to the forefront of the conversation, I think is kind of, again, a little bit more potentially, I think, in the weeds, but I think is one of those things that we can use. And I think in terms of, kind of beginning the conversation of how do I actually kind of make a difference on this, I think it's one, encouraging kind of our friends on the right, those in the Republican Party, to make the most of these motions to recommit, really, being thoughtful about these and intentional about these, to use these in a way that help to force those meaningful debates. And then I think, too, using these as an accountability point with Democrats, and really kind of beginning the conversation on some of these, back to the idea of these radical policy positions that they hold. And so, James.
Well, so I think grassroots, we on the grassroots here on the ground have, especially in blue districts or swing districts, have some of the most important roles to play on this front. So anytime we're trying to force a debate, or especially anytime we're able to get members on record, have them answer for that some way, whether it be writing a letter to the editor, to your local paper, or whether it be raising the issue at your church or to your friends and family, those sorts of things. Obviously, we want to be able to talk about, hey, this debate's going on. This is where I stand on the issue. My member of Congress, maybe didn't agree with that stance and went on the other side of that issue. And really, the more that we're able to talk about some of these debates and fights that are going on publicly, we're going to be able to educate our friends and family and neighbors on these issues. And trust me, they're going to have opinions on this stuff. This is real life. It's not just wonky policy all the time. Sometimes it can feel that way, but I think so far the Republicans who have been kind of spearheading this motion to recommit strategy have done a good job of making it policies that real Americans care about, right? And so that's an important thing that we can be doing. But mainly it's about forcing the left to answer for their positions. If we don't do that, then we're really missing out on an opportunity and really a key plank of accountability. So while we're here talking about accountability, everyone needs accountability, right? It's the left, but also the right. Now that looks different in each regard. It can be both positive, it can be negative. It can sometimes use the terms carrot and stick. It looks different. So we talked about Democrats having to answer for their positions. But our next point here is keeping the right united against liberal priority legislation. So what this means, so I mentioned before a couple of the bills. The Equality Act is one. But really an excellent example of this is H.R. 1, which was the federal elections takeover bill. It's basically the Democrats' #1 priority. The House voted on this, and more or less what it would do is federalize elections. It would, among other things, allow basically anyone to vote. I think many of you heard yesterday that brought up how the wording of the bill, I think it was Congressman Collins who pointed that out. According to the wording of the bill, you cannot stop anyone from voting, which is absurd. It's basically a naked partisan attempt to skew the electoral process in the favor of the Democrats, and that's more or less what the bill is designed to do. So it's obviously their top priority. It's a huge priority for them, but it's a great example on this front of keeping the right united because 0 Republicans voted in favor of that bill when it passed the House. So it passed the House with all Democrat votes, and it's dead on arrival in the Senate right now, which, I mean, that's about as stark as you can get. You can say, okay, well, hey, the Democrats are in favor of this. Here's why that's a bad thing, but by the way, there's a better way, right? Republicans did not add their names to that bill, did not give it credence, did not give it any kind of momentum. And that's an important aspect of this. I think another good example is the Equality Act that I mentioned before. And this is an example of where maybe we can do a better job of accountability. The Equality Act, I mean, we talked about what it does, and for all of those bad policy outcomes, unfortunately, there were 8 Republicans who voted for that bill, one of whom was a co-sponsor of the bill, which is unfortunate. But with a policy like that has such wide-ranging effects for society as a whole, you really don't want to go adding momentum or giving that bill extra life, right? The second thing we want to point out here is that once a member votes for a policy and goes on record in one way or the other, it's harder later to get them to switch their position. I'm not going to say that it's baked in permanently, and trust me, it's never too late to get it right. If you change your opinion and you change your vote to the right side later, hey, more power to you, that's awesome. But unfortunately, once a member of Congress goes on record in favor or against a certain policy, it is harder to get them to flip later on. So we don't want them to get baked in there. The last thing I'll say on this point is that we just don't want, I mean, Republican members of Congress, but really just any of us to get caught sleeping on these votes and these issues. Now, when it's a Democratic priority bill like H.R. 1 or H.R. 5 or H.R. 8, it might be easier to spot. I mean, it's going to be announced with fanfare by the left. It's going to be announced, and you know, the leadership is going to tout it. They're going to go out and talk about this great bill that we passed, and oh, it's so good for the American people. Why are you not supporting this great bill called the Equality Act? Who can be against that, right? But it's for the smaller policies, and especially on kind of the more obscure policies that we need to keep our eyes open. And the point here is that the Equality Act, yes, it passed the House. It's dead on arrival in the Senate. But look at it like this. It's like the whole loaf, right? The left would be ecstatic if they got that bill passed into law. It's not going to happen with a Republican majority in the Senate and President Trump in the White House. But they will be just as happy to splinter off individual policies like this and kind of shoehorn them into what's called must-pass bills in other places. They do this almost every time a National Defense Authorization Act comes up. They will put SOGI language, basically the operative language of the Equality Act, to basically make our military a social experiment instead of about national defense. They'll add it to appropriations bills, things that are very difficult for many members to vote against for parochial reasons or different reasons like that, whether it be district interest or whatever. But they'll put these bad policies in there and dare members to vote against the underlying package. So we really need to be vigilant on this stuff. We can't just be on the lookout for a particular bill. We need to be on the lookout for a policy and this push that they're doing. So, we've talked a lot about kind of the legislative side, but what can we do practically on that? I mean, I think this kind of goes along with what Stephanie said about the August recess earlier, but for Republican members, right? So set up a meeting with your member. Just talk about these issues, point out the fact that, hey, a lot of these proposals that are coming out, especially of these Democratic offices, are quite frankly terrible. Not many people agree with these, but it's important that we not just sit back and disagree with it. We need to be out there talking about the consequences of these bills. It's real life consequences, and it's consequences that are extremely unpopular, so we can point to those. You'll be out and you'll see them around at events, especially in August, as they're going around to groups, as they're going to community events and stuff like that. Be sure you introduce yourself. If they voted against H.R. 5, the Equality Act, which every member of the Georgia delegation did, be sure and thank them for that. Be sure and thank them for standing up against those terrible policies. And it's not just H.R. 5, it's really anything. Anytime they take a tough vote and stand for conservative principle, be sure you're thanking them, because that goes a long way. A creative way to do that is not just thanking them in person, which is great. Always do that any chance you get whenever they're doing the right thing. But I know that this idea was tossed out yesterday in one of the sessions, that get a group of people together and write some thank you cards that you can deliver to the office, hand deliver to the member, and you can rest assured that they're going to see those, or at least see the stack, hear, hey, like all these people thanked you for taking a righteous stand on this, wanted to pass this along. So don't miss an opportunity to be able to do that, because that's a really important part of just helping out the people who are fighting for principle to continue to do so and stay in the fight. And if it's a big issue, like Born Alive or anything like this, where they're really like leading the charge, they're out there, they are on the news, they're talking about the issue, maybe it's worth doing a sign wave or something like that. I heard one really impactful example of a group of concerned citizens who really appreciated a vote that their member had just taken, and he was on the way back from Congress, flying back to the district, and at the route from the airport, like on the way to his office, they lined the streets in the rain with signs that said, "Thank you, Congressman, for this." And I remember him telling that story, and he almost broke down in tears, talking about like how meaningful it was for him to feel that thankfulness back home in the district. So don't miss an opportunity to do that. I mean, we want to try to help these guys out any way we can and really thank them when they're doing the right thing. So Stephanie, I know we've talked a lot about kind of the here and now, the legislative battles like at this moment, but we don't want to lose sight of what's happening between now and the 2020 election. We don't just want to sit on our rear ends and twiddle our thumbs and miss opportunities to build for the future. What are some things that we can do to kind of do that and put lead on the target and really be ready to pound the pavement later?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, because I think it's really important that we not get too ahead of ourselves and also be engaging in the legislative fights that are here and now, but also be thinking about what's ahead. And I think at the end of the day, we as conservatives, we're not just here to gain political power for its own sake, right? We're here to be able to advance conservative policy ideas and to move those and make those a reality. And so I think the kind of first thing that I'll say kind of looking ahead to 2020 and sort of how do we build momentum for a conservative policy agenda, I think it kind of goes back to some of what Nate, our colleague, was talking about yesterday, which is really encouraging, I think, especially our friends on the right, to run on a bold conservative agenda. I think, sort of the polling that we've seen shows a lot of really great opportunities and a lot of overlap between some of the issues that are animating the electorate, I think anxieties that they have, and also where we have conservative solutions to those questions and to some of those anxieties. And so really encouraging them to be bold, to build that agenda and to really build an agenda that's going to inspire the American people. So I think that's where we can really, as we're building those relationships with kind of our Republican congressmen, to really encourage them to take advantage of that and to be bold and to lead. But I think in terms of, what does it look like for kind of us as sort of everyday citizens, we're not in Congress, maybe we're just kind of on the beginnings of getting involved into politics, what can we really do? Because I think we talked about, a lot of different ideas because we want to kind of share just sort of some of the things that are a little bit more out of the box. A lot of folks kind of get started with calling their member of Congress or they're getting on social media, but we also want to kind of share some of the things that you can do in terms of taking that next step in terms of really, I think, leading in your communities. And that goes back to, I think, the three things that we really always encourage Sentinels to do, which is our kind of grassroots program. And it's to really, I think, know, to grow, and to go. And so I think to know the issues, the policy issues are hard. I think really at Heritage Action is for you to know a policy issue just as well or better than your member of Congress, which quite frankly sometimes does happen.
It happens all the time.
It does happen. We really want them to be smart and to be knowledgeable about the issues and to be able to go toe-to-toe with anyone in a policy debate. And so I think that's really important that we educate ourselves first and foremost and to be smart on the issues. I think the second thing is really, I think, what I think in terms of kind of a key priority now, between now and 2020, which is building our networks and really growing your network. And I think that term can get thrown around, and I remember kind of coming out of college and everyone talked about the importance of networking, and it felt like this really nebulous thing that was a little intimidating of I just need to go introduce myself to really important people. And I think it really just starts with introducing yourself to your neighbor at your table. I think it can feel really daunting. So I say this as an introvert, quite frankly. There is nothing, part of my job means working rooms, but there's also part of me as an introvert that's a little hard. And so I think it just quite frankly starts with introducing yourself to your neighbor. So I think, for this weekend, introduce yourself to the person who's sitting next to you at that round table. And then I think over time that builds. I once heard the expression, the more people you know, the more people you know. The more people you know, the more that your network can introduce you to their network and you continue to build your network. And I think the reason that matters is it helps you, I think, really to build influence because then you're a known person in your community and people know you. They know that you know the issues, that you're smart on the policy, and that you're kind of connected in your community. You're not just some person who showed up, but you're invested and really being a part of growing, and advancing conservative policies in your community. And I think the thing that I always think about with kind of what we call kind of grassroots activism, which is really, I think, just everyday citizens getting involved in the legislative process is really what it's a fancy kind of term for that. But I think the thing that I've really been struck by over the years as I've worked kind of in the trenches of politics with just everyday citizens who want to get involved, which is it really builds compound interest. The more that you know the issues, the more that you know that issue the next time it comes around the legislative process. The more people you know, the more people that you continue to be able to build your network with. I've kind of walked kind of alongside different kind of Sentinels that started off as just a citizen who, started with maybe a tough conversation with a member that got, a little heated and were a little daunted to now have the cell phone number of their member of Congress and their U.S. Senator and are engaging them in meaningful conversations on the policy fights that are happening today. And so I think at the end of the day, you don't always see maybe the highest return on investment at the beginning, but I think the longer that you really stick out with getting involved in the political process in your community, I think the more impact that you are able to have over the long run and really, I think, make a difference.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Sentinels of ours who have, over the years, built relationships with their members and now have their cell phone numbers and can text with them. I mean, I don't want to miss a key point here. I mean, it's a truism. It's that politics is people, fundamentally, and people are connected with relationships. I mean, relationships are a very, very big part of this. And it's not just with each other, not just with members, but kind of everyone's connected in some way, right? And the more that you can get connected, the more that you're able to know the right people in a certain fight to be able to make the right argument, maybe, and sometimes maybe it's grassroots pressure, sometimes maybe it's just a direct conversation or a text or an email. But we're in the season right now where obviously members of Congress are going to be running for re-election coming up in 2020. They're going to be really, really accessible, more so than any other time during election season. They're going to be more likely to give out contact information. They're going to be happy to see you around at events, introduce themselves, get to know you. Be sure you just introduce yourself. Like, don't ever be intimidated. And even if they're not members of Congress yet, build relationships with your state lawmakers or your county councilman or whoever it may be who may be interested in running for office at some point, for higher office at some point. You never know who's going to end up in that position later. And like you said, the more people you know, the more people you know. You never know. You might be good friends with your future congressman. So build those relationships, stay up to date on the issues, but ultimately go out there and take action and try to be as effective as possible. So I know that you mentioned a little bit about the Sentinel program. We do want to urge you, if you're interested in any of this information or getting more in the weeds with accountability or legislation or process, come by. We've got a table out in the hallway. We're going to be there the rest of the day. Come say hey if you're interested in getting more info about the Sentinel program. Stop by. We'd love to tell you more about it and help get you involved any way that we can. I think the important thing here is that the food fight that goes on in the media is always going to be there. It's going to take place no matter what, right? Like, we need to focus on what we can focus on. I mean, all it takes is the president to tweet something and the media is going to go nuts over it, right? Trust me, that's going to happen whether we are engaged on that in the moment or not. If we keep in front of us what matters, keep our eyes on the ball, which is policy, which is really getting conservative principle put in place, we can be really, really effective. So if you're interested in hearing more, or if you have questions for us, I know we're running out of time here, we'll be out at the table, so feel free to stop by, say hey. But thank you guys for having us, and hope you enjoy the rest of the day.